Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is Lesson 21, Part 2. I'm going to show you just a few rows of garter stitch. Many patterns begin that way. It can be kind of a frame, a piece that's like a cable afghan. Sometimes a pattern will begin in garter stitch or even a ribbing, just so the piece doesn't roll. Otherwise, stockinette has a tendency to roll up on the bottom edge. So, we're going to do it both ways. I'm going to show it to you on knitting needles, and then we're actually going to film it today from the other side of the knitting rods. And the reason I'm going to do that is because when you read knitting patterns and you're looking at books, it's going to be easier for you to understand what's happening from the perspective of between the rods looking at it this way. Normally, you're sitting here when you're doing the stationary rods, which is the opposite. So your perspective is the opposite. This will make more sense as we go along. So we're just going to put on 6 stitches. And we're going to use a slingshot cast on. If you ever work knitting needles, by the way, you want to make sure that when you do your stitches, they're loose and you're forming them on the even side of the pipe. Now this is a US 35 pipe, so it's a little bit smaller than your knitting rods, but it's only 2 millimeters or so different. So there's your 6 stitches. Now let's put 6 stitches on your pipe. And we can do this just as we did on the other day. And making the, let's open that up so you can see a little better. Put that on the loop of, this is your tail, coming around your thumb. Hold that down. Then that piece that's running between your fingers and your thumb is what goes around the pipe. Your working yarn goes from left to right or clockwise, and then this loop comes over. If you want to snug it up, pull your working yarn. If you want to make the knot tighter, the loop, pull your tail. We'll make 6. Whoops, I started a slingshot. That doesn't matter. So this is just what I showed you the other day, so we're going to whiz bang through here. Alright, now you've got 6 stitches on, and I have 6 stitches on my knitting needle. Now, you noticed I cast onto the right side of my pipe. I always do that. That helps me remember that these are the odd number rows, these are the even number rows, and I think the reason I did that originally because it's easier to turn the whole stand and I can just cast on that way. But it's also how you hold the knitting needles when you begin. So now you've got your cast on. We're going to start on the knitting needles. And what I want to point out here, again, when you get your knitting books, everything is going to be from this perspective as if you're knitting like this. So you have to kind of think backwards because you're sitting on this side of the rod stand. So you begin a knit stitch. The directions will say, insert the working needle, which is your empty needle, from left to right. What they mean is, because it'll look like this in the picture, and you'll go, why do they mean left from right? They mean as if you were moving from the end of the knitting needle to the tip. So insert the working needle into the front of the stitch. And by the way, later on, when you get more advanced, there's all kind of things they do behind the stitch too. But for a typical knit pattern, and that's what your pattern might say. It might say knit 4 rows. They mean to do that in garter stitch. If they're putting it on straight knitting needles or circular needles that are being used as straight needles, they might just say knit row 1 and repeat through 4 rows, and they might say knit 4 rows or do in garter stitch for 6 rows. This is what they mean. So again, you're going to put the working needle into the stitch, wrap the yarn, the working yarn, clockwise. But see what happens to the working yarn now. I'm pulling it through essentially from the back to the front. My hands are a little sweaty. I'm having trouble making my... So you see that when I stick my needle in there, my working needle, into that stitch, I'm taking it out there. I'm hooking, basically, the working yarn and bringing it through from back to front. I'm getting these way too tight. So I'm bringing the working yarn each time through, around, and taking the stitch off. This is hard to do in slow motion with sweaty hands, I'll tell you. Alright, there are some very bad looking stitches. Now, let's go to our stationary rods. So I've done one row of knit stitches. Forgot to click my clicker. I like to click it at the beginning. Now, watch what happens on the rods. When I take off my first stitch, as any stitch, you know, this is the one that's always a little tricky, and I'm going to work them right here in the center so Joe can film this. That yarn is in my hand, and I'm poking it up through there and bringing it up. Let's make that first one. I'm going to keep these way apart so you can see. And I always call this the front stitch. But thinking to what I just did with the knitting needles, you can see that I'm actually taking the yarn and moving it from the back of the stitch to the front if I were sitting here. I'm not going to snug these up because I have to have the rods too tight. So you see that my front stitch, what I've called front stitch all along, is really your knit stitch. Let me hold that up more so that the angle's better. Is that better if I do that? If I hold this up and I'm bringing the yarn through this way, it doesn't matter if I'm holding it down here, it's still what I've always called the front stitch. But you can see if I were sitting on the other end, like these were knitting needles in my hand, I'm really going in the other side. And that's why this front stitch is actually the knit stitch. When you go to work these patterns and you see, you're only going to see knit and purl, you're not going to see front and back. I made that up. So, that was your first row. Now I'm going to begin row 2. You notice that I don't take this pipe and move it over here. As this is facing you, this is my even number row now. I just worked row number 1. Now I'm going to work row number 2. Now, to make garter stitch on knitting needles, you notice now I took the stitches I worked and I moved them into my left hand again. So you just make more knit stitches again. And again, they'll be called, it's called knitting, but it's also called the knit stitch. And again, you're just going to go into the needle. The picture will look like this. And then yarn will wrap around, whether you're holding your yarn in your right hand or your left hand. This is continental, so the yarn is in my left hand. And the old stitch comes off. The yarn comes around, and I've pulled that new yarn through to make a stitch. But you can see that really what I'm doing is using this needle in my right hand to basically hook the working yarn and bring it through from back to front. Doing a really bad job here. Alright, but you get the idea. Wooden needles are nice, those bamboo ones. Alright, so now I've completed 2 rows. And notice what happens again. The stitches are now, the finished stitches are in my right hand. And when I go to start row 3, they're going to come over here. And this is a pretty weak job, but you can already see that this is actually garter stitch. The sides are the same. That doesn't happen when I do the pipes. Now when I start row 2, if I want to do garter stitch, I have to change my stitch. This time I'm going to do back stitches. But you can see, and I'll do a row of purl. In fact, let me do that right now, just so to show you what a purl stitch is on knitting needles. So when you see purl, which is spelled P-U-R-L, what they mean is you're going to take the yarn now, comes to the front, just like I tell you on back stitches to put it up, right? So, let's pretend, actually, in fact, let's face it this way. I think this will help. So here's my stitches, and I'm going to make a purl stitch. I'm going to now take my working yarn, or my working needle, and put it through the stitch from right to left. So I have to go in this way, into the front. Then the yarn goes around clockwise, then I take my finger down to kind of push the yarn. This is hard to do. All right, now I've got that yarn on there, and those come off, and this goes up. And I keep the yarn to the front. I always tell you to keep it up. But this is what you're doing, okay? Coming from right to left, so coming basically from behind the stitch to the front of the stitch, working, pulling the working yarn through, putting it on the needle, pushing that off, pushing that up, okay? Now, that's how you do a purl stitch. So that's why I've always said when you do your back stitches, you're going to hold your yarn up, you're going to bring your stitch off, and you're going to come in this way, just like I did with the knitting needles. Now I call this the back stitch because as I'm sitting here facing the ends, that's coming from back to front. And you can snug it with your fingers if you want to. So the yarn comes up, this comes off, this goes through this way, and on the knitting needles you saw that I did it this way. And you pipe it. So when I call these back stitches, they're really, if you were holding them in your hand, they're front stitches, aren't they? You can see that I'm actually taking that yarn, putting the working yarn that's here through the front, if you were sitting here. So there's a change of perspective when you sit at the other end. It's easy for me mnemonically to remember that that's a back stitch because when I take that off, I'll have my little bow tie sign, and that helps me remember what I did last. So that's, and again, you clicked row 2, so now I'm going to start row 3. It's garter stitch. To do garter stitch, so now I worked odd, even, odd. Now I'm going to begin another odd row. On pipes, that means I need to knit a row again. So when I say you reverse, and again, oops, I should hold that up here. So here I am, and I push that yarn through to make my new stitch. From this side of the pipes, I'm going in through the front, but from where Joe has the camera and where you're looking right now, that's really the back of the stitch. And that's how it's going to appear to you in knitting books, because that's how you would hold knitting needles, not the way I have them here. But to use the stationary rods, this is much easier to sit on this end, and you won't drop all your strands of yarn. One of the trickiest things to do if you're working with straight knitting needles is holding on to all your yarn. And again, I did those as purl stitches. Let me do a couple more of those and you'll see. Again, this is not a very good job in knitting, but so I apologize. Now, just like I did just now on that previous row, when I do a purl stitch, you'll see that my needle comes through the back to the front, right to left. The yarn gets hooked, goes around the pipe, the knitting needle, clockwise. The stitch, there's the new stitch, here's the old stitch. Now I got to slide that off and push that down. So that's how it's going to look when you see these knitting patterns. So, again, every time I work a stitch, work a row on knitting needles, I'm going to put those stitches I worked back into my left hand. That doesn't happen on the pipes. So, the easiest thing, again, what I just got in the habit of doing is always casting onto my right side, the right side of the stand, because that would be where your stitches are every time you begin a row when you're knitting. So let's finish that row with the purl stitches. And now all my stitches are back into my right hand. And when I go to knit another row, I'm turning it over. And that is why knitting on the rods or joining circular knitting, like the knitting hoop I show in some of my videos, or like when you use circular knitting or circular needles to knit in the round, you're always working on the right side. you never turn it over and work basically what's called the wrong side. So I hope that clears things up and makes things a little easier. And I think when we do the next video with the pattern, it'll help make more sense. Thanks for watching.